the 17th of January 1942. The dense, humid air of the Pacific hangs heavy over the Japanese fleet, anchored at Rabaul, Papua New Guinea. The sun rises slowly, casting long shadows across the decks of massive battleships and aircraft carriers. The sea is calm, but the tension is not. Below the surface, men shuffle nervously on the hard steel, whispering quietly amongst themselves. It's a typical morning for the Imperial Japanese Navy, a force the world has learned to fear. Confident, perhaps even arrogant in their dominance. They laugh at the thought of American bombers hulking, slow, and outdated. A joke, they say. They had been told of these so-called B-17 flying fortresses, large lumbering machines that could carry a deadly payload across vast distances, but here, in the heart of their fleet, they are dismissed as a threat. To the Japanese soldiers, they are a passing nuisance, an inconvenience, nothing to fear. But soon, they will see the power of the American bombers, a power they had underestimated, mocked, and ignored, a force that will tear through their fleet, shattering their sense of invincibility. And in that moment, their laughter will fade. The early days of World War II in the Pacific were marked by an overwhelming sense of Japanese invincibility. From their rapid expansion across Southeast Asia to their seemingly unstoppable victories in the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy, bolstered by its fleet of advanced ships and aircraft, had established a dominance that few could contest. Their military leadership, confident in their superiority, saw themselves as a modern empire, destined to challenge Western powers. By the end of 1941, Japan had already dealt significant blows to the Allied forces. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th had crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and the conquest of the Philippines and other Pacific territories had pushed the Allies into a defensive position. At this point, Japan's naval strategy was focused on expanding its territorial holdings and securing vital resources, including oil from the Dutch East Indies. However, the Japanese underestimated the power that was rising in response. The United States, still reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor, was quickly mobilizing its industrial might and military resources. Although the Japanese had dealt a devastating blow to the U.S. Navy, they failed to recognize the resilience and innovation of the American military. The U.S. was determined to retaliate, and soon they would unleash a new form of warfare. The American bombers that would eventually change the course of the Pacific War were not yet the dominant force they would become. The B-17 Flying Fortress, developed in the 1932, was initially seen as an experimental aircraft. Its design was revolutionary, a long-range bomber equipped with heavy armor and a formidable payload capacity. But to the Japanese, the Flying Fortress seemed little more than a slow-moving target, easy prey for their skilled pilots in faster, more agile aircraft. The early American bombing raids over the Pacific in 1942 were largely ineffective. On the 18th of April 1942, the Doolittle raid, a symbolic but largely ineffective strike on Tokyo, showed the potential of American bombers. But the full impact of American air power would take time to manifest. The Japanese military continued to dismiss the threat, focused more on their naval superiority and the strength of their carriers and battleships. By May 1942, the situation was changing. The Japanese were confident that their overwhelming naval strength would continue to ensure victory. But the US was making strides in the development and deployment of more advanced bombing strategies. The Japanese would soon be faced with the reality that their naval superiority could be shattered from the air. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought between May 4 to 8, 1942, marked the first real confrontation where American bombers would prove their worth. It was the first battle fought entirely by aircraft, with no ships coming into direct contact with each other. While the U.S. Navy lost the battle in terms of ships, it managed to halt the Japanese advance toward Port Moresby in New Guinea, and more importantly, the bombers began to demonstrate their capacity to inflict significant damage on Japan's carriers. The psychological shock of this newfound American aerial power was enough to rattle the Japanese military, but there was still a sense of doubt among the Japanese. The bombers were still seen as a nuisance, capable of occasional damage but no real threat to their fleet. The belief that the Imperial Japanese Navy would remain unchallenged in the Pacific persisted until the bombers arrived in full force, changing everything in a matter of months. By the spring of 1942, the Japanese had grown accustomed to the idea that their naval and air superiority in the Pacific was an unshakable reality. Their fleet, composed of formidable aircraft carriers like the Akagi and Kaga, and their most powerful battleships, including the Yamato, were designed to dominate. Their pilots, highly trained and led by experienced commanders, were lauded for their exceptional skills. This confidence allowed them to dismiss the growing American bomber threat, which appeared at first to be little more than an annoyance. However, what the Japanese failed to fully understand was the increasing capability of American aircraft and the shifting focus of U.S. military strategy. The B-17 Flying Fortress, once thought of as little more than a slow and cumbersome bomber, had evolved over the course of the war. Despite its limitations, the B-17 was becoming a more lethal force, capable of devastating high-altitude bombing raids on naval and land-based targets alike. The B-24 Liberator, another American bomber with a longer range and heavier payload, also began to see more active use, with both bombers now working in tandem. The real turning point, however, was the development of the American concept of strategic bombing, which focused not just on hitting military targets, but on disrupting the very core of the enemy's infrastructure, morale, and ability to fight. American commanders understood that the Japanese relied heavily on their carriers for naval power. Striking at the heart of the Japanese fleet would disrupt their ability to wage war on the scale they had been accustomed to. The Japanese, on the other hand, continued to focus their resources on their naval fleet, underestimating the American bombers' growing ability to deliver devastating blows. The mindset within the Imperial Navy remained focused on tactics of engagement and defense with fighter aircraft or using their formidable naval guns to destroy any incoming threats. They were blinded by the power of their own ships and aircraft, believing they could weather any assault from the air. But the world was about to change for them. The shift would begin in earnest with the Battle of Midway, just a few weeks after the Battle of the Coral Sea. In June 1942, American intelligence, aided by codebreakers, had cracked Japanese communication codes and learned of Japan's planned attack on Midway Atoll. This gave the U.S. Navy a crucial advantage, and they prepared for a decisive confrontation. For the Japanese, Midway was a critical strategic objective. They sought to eliminate the remaining American carriers in the Pacific, ensuring their dominance in the region. But they underestimated one crucial factor: the ability of American bombers to strike with precision and overwhelming force. On the 4th of June 1942, the American bombers would change the course of history. For the first time, Japanese soldiers and sailors would witness firsthand the destructive power of American bombers, not just as a nuisance, but as a decisive weapon that could cripple their most powerful ships in mere moments. As American bombers took to the skies, they were determined not to just defend, but to deliver a blow that would shatter the perceived invincibility of Japan's fleet. The battle, fought with the backdrop of relentless aerial bombardments and tense moments of uncertainty, would mark the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance in the Pacific. The Japanese soldiers who had once laughed at the sight of these slow-moving bombers would soon realize their mistake, an error that would cost them dearly. The American bombers were not only capable of massive destruction, but also revealed a new era of warfare, one that the Japanese had failed to anticipate. As the first American bombers appeared in the skies above Japanese naval bases and fleet formations, the reaction from the Japanese soldiers was one of disbelief. Many had been trained to respect the superiority of their own aircraft, their agile Zero fighters, the envy of the world. But these American bombers? Slow, cumbersome, and easily outmaneuvered, what threat could they possibly pose? In the warm, oppressive heat of the Pacific, with the scent of salt water in the air, Japanese soldiers stood at attention on the decks of their ships, staring upward at the distant figures of the American bombers. For a while, there was nothing but confusion. They laughed at the sight, some jeering, others dismissing them as easy targets. "These bombers are nothing," one officer might have said, his voice confident, perhaps even mocking. The view from the deck was of a single far-off threat, and they were certain their fighters would swat them down before they could cause any real harm. The laughter was short-lived. As the bombers drew closer, the situation changed. In the moments before the attack, the Japanese soldiers noticed something strange. The bombers weren't scattering like they expected. There was no retreat. The planes flew in tight formations, maintaining their course, their bomb bays ready. The soldiers began to feel the first pangs of doubt. Could these bombers actually hit their fleet? First bombs hit their ships in rapid succession, and the laughter quickly turned to shock and disbelief. The explosions were devastating, and the immense fireball that followed seemed almost too impossible to comprehend. For the first time, the soldiers understood the depth of their underestimation. The bombers were not slow-moving targets. They were powerful, precise, and relentless. The human element of this shock was immense. Many soldiers who had once stood tall with confidence were now left wide-eyed and overwhelmed. The reality of war had crashed into their complacency, and it was devastating. The early American bombing campaigns in the Pacific were far from flawless, but they provided a glimpse of the immense tactical advantage that would soon be fully realized. In the early months of 1942, the Japanese military largely dismissed the effectiveness of bombing raids. They were confident that their fighters and fleet could handle any threat posed by American aircraft. What they failed to recognize was the power of coordinated strategic bombing and how it could cripple the Japanese war machine from within. The tactics employed by the American bombers were innovative. American commanders realized that bombers could be used not just to hit targets of opportunity, but to deliver decisive, crippling blows against the enemy's most vulnerable points. The bombers, whether B-17 seconds or B-24 seconds, would not engage in dogfights or try to outmaneuver Japanese fighters. Instead, they relied on altitude, precision, and firepower. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, American bombers launched strikes against the Japanese carriers, using their formidable bomb load to inflict real damage. Though the battle itself was not a clear-cut victory for the US, it demonstrated the potential of bombing runs to disrupt the Japanese fleet. American bombers made their strikes with great precision, targeting vital areas of the ships, the hangars, fuel stores, and aircraft on the decks. These bombers were not just a tool of retaliation, but a powerful weapon capable of crippling a naval force that had, until then, been seen as invulnerable. When the bombers struck, they did so with devastating impact. Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the decks of their carriers, and fires erupted throughout the vessels. In many instances, the bombs left devastating, long-lasting damage that could not be easily repaired. This tactical approach began to show the Japanese the flaws in their strategy. Their reliance on the physical might of their fleet was no match for the precision strikes that American bombers could deliver from the sky. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were marvels of American engineering. While both aircraft were initially seen as crude or inefficient by many critics, they had evolved into some of the most effective tools of war by the early 1942. These bombers weren't just heavy machines, they were flying fortresses designed for long-range combat, and they were armed with the latest technology that made them much more dangerous than the Japanese had anticipated. The B-17 was a four-engine bomber, able to fly at altitudes above most enemy aircraft, making it difficult to intercept. Its range was formidable, allowing it to carry out long-range missions over vast stretches of the Pacific. Armed with 10 to 13 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, the B-17 could defend itself against enemy fighters, a feature that made it more difficult to down during attacks. But it wasn't just the firepower that made the B-17 such an asset. It was the bomb load it could carry. Capable of dropping over 4,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs, it had the ability to devastate strategic targets. The B-24 Liberator, with its longer range and even greater bomb capacity, was another key player in the American bombing campaigns. The B-24's robust design allowed it to carry heavier bomb loads over longer distances, making it invaluable in the Pacific theater. It was more versatile than the B-17, capable of being used for bombing raids, anti-submarine missions, and reconnaissance. The increased operational flexibility of the B-24 would allow it to strike deep into enemy-held territory, a characteristic that would prove critical in battles like Midway. The combination of these bombers, alongside the growing precision of American bombing tactics, created a perfect storm for the Japanese. The bombers were now more than just machines. They were instruments of destruction, capable of carrying out strategic, decisive strikes on the heart of the Japanese fleet. The leadership of the Imperial Japanese Navy had always been defined by its confidence and strategic aggressiveness. Senior commanders, deeply entrenched in the tradition of naval power, dismissed the idea that aerial bombardment could significantly alter the course of the war. They were convinced that the superiority of their naval tactics and the deadly efficiency of their fleet would ensure victory against any foe. In their eyes, bombers were nothing more than a nuisance to be dealt with by their fighters. However, by mid-1942, the repeated bombings of their fleet, particularly during the Battle of the Coral Sea, began to erode this sense of invulnerability. The attack on their carriers, although not decisive, forced Japanese military leaders to reconsider their approach to warfare. In the aftermath of the Coral Sea, the Japanese realized that their carrier fleets could not remain unscathed by bombing runs. The damage inflicted was enough to make them question the sustainability of their naval strategy. Yet, despite this realization, the Japanese leadership struggled to adapt. The Imperial Navy's initial response to the American bomber threat was to reinforce their fighter aircraft. But their agile Zero fighters, while capable of dogfights, were ill-suited to intercepting the more numerous and well-coordinated bomber formations. The Japanese also underestimated the strategic importance of the American bombers' precision strikes. Instead of re-evaluating their approach, they doubled down on their tactics, relying even more heavily on their carriers, and continued to focus on engaging U.S. forces in decisive, large-scale naval battles. This lack of flexibility and foresight would prove to be a critical mistake. Had the Japanese leadership more fully grasped the threat of strategic bombing and adapted their tactics accordingly, the outcome of key battles like Midway might have been different. Instead, the Japanese military, locked in a mindset of naval superiority, continued to underestimate the full power of American air forces, an underestimation that would cost them dearly in the coming months. The Japanese soldiers and sailors who had once laughed at the sight of American bombers were now forced to reckon with their devastating power. The American bombing raids, often dismissed as ineffective, proved to be far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. What the Japanese failed to recognize in the beginning was the sheer scale of the American industrial effort behind these bombers. Each raid was not just a single aircraft, but a highly coordinated strike force capable of overwhelming defenses. The Japanese also underestimated the role of American tactics in the bombing runs. Initially, it was thought that bombers would be vulnerable to interception, especially given their slower speed compared to the nimble Japanese Zero fighters. But the American bombers operated in tight formations, with mutual defense built into their design. The heavy armament of the B-17 and B-24, combined with their ability to fly at high altitudes, made them far harder to destroy than the Japanese had predicted. The Japanese pilots, skilled as they were, simply could not keep up with the bombers' speed and firepower. As a result, many of their attempts to intercept or destroy the bombers failed. This disparity in capabilities began to shift the momentum of the war in the Pacific. The impact on the Japanese fleet was immediate and severe. For the first time, they witnessed American bombers delivering a precise and coordinated attack that crippled key elements of their naval forces. This was no longer a case of a nuisance in the sky. It was a serious, capable weapon that was destroying their fleet. What had been dismissed as ineffective was now the most potent force they had encountered. War is not only fought on the battlefield, it is also fought in the minds of the soldiers who experience it. For the Japanese, the first bombings delivered by American bombers were a psychological shock. The sudden destruction, the sense of helplessness as bombs fell from the sky and crippled their mighty ships, shattered their confidence. These were soldiers and sailors who had been raised in a culture of invincibility. They were the elite of the Pacific, trained, disciplined, and prepared for combat. Yet, when faced with the relentless power of American bombers, they were powerless. This psychological blow was compounded by the realization that their fleet could be destroyed in an instant. They had been raised on the belief that naval supremacy meant everything: the destruction of their carriers, their ships, their aircraft. These were the physical manifestations of their empire's might. Now, these symbols of power were being torn apart by machines they had once scorned. On the American side, the moral effect was equally profound. In the early months of the war, there had been a sense of doubt, a feeling that the Pacific campaign was unwinnable. But as the bombers began to strike with greater success, a shift in morale occurred. The ability to retaliate with overwhelming air power was a game-changer. The crews of these bombers, men who had been tasked with executing some of the most dangerous missions in the Pacific, took pride in their work. They were not just fighting a war, they were witnessing the evolution of a new kind of warfare, one that relied not just on brute force, but on precision, innovation, and technological prowess. This moral transformation, felt deeply by both sides, would have far-reaching consequences. The Japanese, rattled by the bombings, would begin to doubt their ability to continue the fight. The Americans, seeing their tactics succeed, would push forward with greater resolve, aware that the tide of the war was beginning to turn in their favor. The 4th of June, 1942. The Pacific is a vast expanse of blue, stretching out endlessly beneath a blazing Sunday Midway atoll. A tiny speck of land in the middle of this ocean holds the fate of the Pacific in its grasp. A critical battle is about to unfold, one that will shape the course of history. The Japanese Imperial Navy, with its fleet of powerful carriers and battleships, is poised to strike a decisive blow. Their plan? To eliminate the US Pacific Fleet and solidify their dominance in the Pacific. The American forces, though heavily outnumbered, have one advantage: intelligence. US codebreakers have cracked the Japanese communication codes, revealing the precise timing and location of the attack. The Japanese, unaware of the American knowledge, proceed with their plans, confident in the overwhelming power of their fleet. To them, victory seems inevitable. But as the Japanese carriers move into position, they are unaware that American bombers are already on the hunt. The moment of reckoning has arrived. At 10:20 a.m., the first wave of American bombers, including B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, appears on the horizon. The Japanese fleet is in sight. On the decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, Japanese sailors prepare for battle, expecting the threat of American bombers to be neutralized by their fleet's fighters. However, the American bombers are already diving toward their targets. The first wave of bombers strikes with brutal precision. Their bombs hit the Akagi first, sending shockwaves through the air. The carrier, one of the most formidable ships in the Japanese fleet, is torn apart as bombs explode across her deck, igniting the ammunition and fuel stores. Fire consumes the ship, and within minutes, she is rendered out of action. Moments later, the Kaga follows. A bomb detonates directly over her flight deck, ripping through the hull and setting off a series of secondary explosions. The Japanese carrier, crippled by the attack, begins to burn. The pilots aboard these bombers, trained for one purpose, to strike hard and fast, now see the reality of their efforts. The Japanese fleet, once thought invulnerable, is crumbling beneath them. But this is only the beginning. As the Japanese scramble to launch their fighters, the American bombers continue their assault. The Soryu is next, a massive fireball engulfing the ship as bombs strike deep into her hull. The Hiryu, one of Japan's last hopes, is also hit, and soon, it too is incapacitated. The Japanese response is frantic. Their Zeros, swift and deadly, launch from the decks of their carriers, engaging the bombers in desperate dogfights. But it is too late. The damage has already been done. The four carriers, Japan's greatest strength, are burning, sinking, and beyond repair. On the American side, the atmosphere is tense, but there is a sense of grim satisfaction. The Japanese fleet is in disarray, and the tide of the war is shifting. The bombers have struck a decisive blow, one that will reverberate across the Pacific. The once proud Japanese Navy, with its carriers and battleships, has been dealt a blow it will not recover from. The perception of invincibility has shattered. What was once a laughingstock, the American bomber, has now become the most devastating weapon in the Pacific. But the true weight of the turning point isn't just in the destruction of these ships. It's in the realization that the war is no longer being fought on the terms of the Japanese. The balance of power has begun to tilt, and the psychological impact of these bombing raids will haunt the Japanese military for years to come. The moment of victory, though significant, will not come without consequences. The cost of victory, both in terms of human life and resources, is immense. Yet, for the Americans, this is the first true sign that the war in the Pacific can be won. The bombers, once underestimated and ridiculed, have proven their worth. But the battle is far from over. The Japanese are still dangerous, and the Pacific remains a vast and brutal theatre of war. The destruction of their carriers at Midway is a blow, but the Japanese Navy will not retreat quietly. The war is about to escalate in ways no one could yet fully comprehend. As the smoke from the burning Japanese carriers billows into the sky, the American forces are not yet able to fully comprehend the magnitude of what they've just achieved. The destruction of four of Japan's most powerful carriers in a single day, an unprecedented loss, has crippled the Imperial Navy's ability to project power across the Pacific. But the battle is far from over. The Japanese still have the ability to fight back, and the US forces must move quickly to capitalize on this rare opportunity. As the dust settles, American bombers begin their second wave, pressing the attack with relentless precision. The remaining Japanese ships are scrambling to regroup, their flight decks destroyed, their airstrips rendered useless. The loss of experienced pilots, trained for years to operate on these mighty ships, leaves the Japanese with a dwindling pool of skilled aircrews to defend what's left of their fleet. But there's another brutal truth that sinks in. The American bombers didn't just destroy ships, they've also shattered the Japanese perception of invulnerability. The carriers, the symbol of Japan's naval superiority, are now decimated. No longer are they an unstoppable force in the Pacific. Now, they are little more than burning wrecks, sinking into the deep waters of the Midway Atoll. The weight of this realization hits the Japanese hard. The loss of these carriers is more than just a tactical blow, it is a psychological one. It is as if their most prized possessions, their very sense of dominance, have been torn from them in the span of just a few hours. To make matters worse, the Japanese had no contingency plan for such a devastating loss. The Imperial Navy, so accustomed to dominating the seas with its aircraft carriers, is now left with limited options. The battle is a stunning defeat, one that forces Japan to rethink its entire strategy in the Pacific. The pride of their naval fleet has been reduced to ash, and the consequences are profound. In the aftermath of Midway, Japan's ability to strike offensively is severely impaired. The attack on Midway was supposed to be the turning point in the war, a chance to solidify Japan's control over the Pacific. Instead, it becomes the beginning of their slow and inexorable decline. For the US, the results are nothing short of staggering. The victory at Midway marks the first significant defeat for the Imperial Japanese Navy, and it shifts the balance of power in the Pacific. The US Navy, buoyed by the success of their bombing raids, gains an overwhelming strategic advantage. The loss of the Japanese carriers also disrupts their broader war strategy, as the carriers had been their primary offensive weapon. Without them, Japan is forced to adopt a more defensive posture. This change in strategy, while not immediately evident, will set the stage for the eventual American victory in the Pacific. The victory at Midway is also a clear demonstration of the effectiveness of the American bomber strategy. The bombers, once laughed at and underestimated by the Japanese, have proven their ability to execute precise, effective strikes against the heart of Japan's naval power. The ability of the U.S. to continue these coordinated bombing runs would be the key to further successes, from Guadalcanal to the eventual defeat at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese, in their haste to defend their fleet, had ignored the strategic potential of American bombers, and in doing so, had allowed them to shape the course of the war. For the Japanese soldiers and sailors who had once mocked the American bombers, there is now only silence. The once proud fleet, which had been the centerpiece of Japan's military might, is now a smoking ruin. The morale of the Japanese Navy has been irreparably damaged, and their confidence in their own superiority is shattered. What they had laughed off as a nuisance now stands as a symbol of their defeat. The bombers, in their unexpected power, have proven to be the turning point in the Pacific War, an unforeseen force that would shape the rest of the conflict. The devastation at Midway would be felt far beyond the battle itself. The Japanese, who had long seen themselves as the undisputed rulers of the Pacific, would now face a long and brutal war of attrition. With the American bomber strategy gaining momentum, the war would become one of strategic bombing, island hopping, and naval blockades. Each blow struck by American bombers would weaken Japan's resolve and ability to fight. But the cost of this victory is not lost on the Americans either. As the Midway Atoll burns and sinks beneath the waves, it's clear that while the bombers have decisively shifted the balance of power, the war is far from over. The Japanese, though reeling, are not yet defeated. The path to victory in the Pacific will be long, grueling, and fraught with more destruction. Yet, Midway marks the beginning of the end for the Japanese Navy. The power of the bombers has been realized, and their role in the war has been cemented as a game-changing force. The dust of Midway had barely settled before the consequences of the battle began to unfold across the Pacific. The immediate results were devastating for Japan. 4 of its most powerful aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been destroyed in just a matter of hours. The loss of these carriers crippled the Imperial Navy's ability to wage war on the same scale. Without their carriers, Japan could no longer project power across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Their once unassailable fleet, which had struck fear into the hearts of Allied forces, had been brought to its knees by the very bombers they had once dismissed. For Japan, the impact was not limited to just the physical destruction of ships. The psychological blow was equally severe. The loss of so many experienced pilots, men who had fought in numerous battles, was irreplaceable. The training required to replace them was costly and time-consuming. More than that, the Japanese military, which had built its entire strategy around the superiority of its carriers, found itself suddenly forced to rethink its approach. The loss of Midway, once a crucial element in Japan's broader strategy to expand its control in the Pacific, now forced them into a defensive posture they had not anticipated. The Japanese fleet, once the spearhead of their empire, had become vulnerable. In contrast, the American side saw a swift and resounding victory. The destruction of the Japanese carriers was a turning point in the Pacific War, shifting the balance of naval power firmly in favor of the United States. The American forces had not only halted Japan's advance but had struck a decisive blow to their war capabilities. The loss of so many vital ships left the Japanese Navy unable to carry out offensive operations with the same efficiency and confidence they once had. The bombers, long underestimated and mocked by the Japanese, had proven their worth in a spectacular fashion. The American air power had disrupted Japan's control of the skies, and their fleets now had an opportunity to strike back at the heart of Japanese forces. But while the Japanese fleet was reeling, the American victory at Midway was not without cost. The U.S. Navy had lost a key carrier, the USS Yorktown, which had been heavily damaged in the battle. The loss of the Yorktown was a significant blow, as it was one of the last remaining American carriers in the Pacific. The damage sustained would require weeks of repairs, and this loss created a temporary gap in American naval capabilities. However, the magnitude of the victory at Midway meant that the overall strategic advantage now clearly belonged to the Americans. As the Japanese began to regroup and reconsider their tactics, they faced a harsh reality. Their dominant position in the Pacific was no more. The American victory at Midway had shifted the strategic calculus of the war in a profound way. For the first time since the outbreak of the Pacific conflict, the Japanese were now fighting from a position of vulnerability. As Japan began to assess the long-term damage from Midway, they realized that their chances of victory in the Pacific were becoming slimmer. The psychological impact on the Japanese population was also profound. The Japanese military had convinced its citizens of the invincibility of their fleet, the ultimate symbol of Japanese strength. The destruction of these carriers and the news of their loss, which soon reached the home islands, shattered the public's perception of their military's invulnerability. The blow to morale was not just on the battlefield but at home as well. Japan, once seemingly unstoppable, was now on the defensive. On the American side, Midway was celebrated as a tremendous success. The U.S. Navy, now buoyed by this victory, found itself with renewed confidence and momentum. The success of American bombers in destroying the Japanese fleet demonstrated the effectiveness of the U.S. air strategy, and this new confidence would propel the Americans forward in the coming months. The victory at Midway opened the door for a series of offensives in the Pacific, including the subsequent campaigns at Guadalcanal, the Solomon Islands, and beyond. The Japanese, now retreating on multiple fronts, would never fully recover from the loss. The American bombing raids that had delivered the decisive blows during the Battle of Midway now set the stage for the next phase of the war. These bombers, once the source of mockery and skepticism, had proven themselves as instruments of change, capable of altering the entire course of the war. The lesson was clear. Air power, when used effectively and strategically, could shift the balance of naval warfare, and the era of carrier dominance was beginning to wane. The psychological and strategic impact of Midway would echo throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The American bombers that had once been underestimated now stood as a symbol of resilience, of a turning tide in the fight against Japanese imperialism. And for the Japanese, the bitter reality was that the war they had once dominated had taken a sharp and irreversible turn. Midway marked the first real shift in momentum in the Pacific and the beginning of the long road to Japan's defeat. In the weeks and months following the Battle of Midway, the fallout was deeply felt across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy, which had been designed for fast, aggressive offensives, now found itself on the defensive. With the loss of 4 aircraft carriers, a significant number of experienced pilots, and hundreds of aircraft, Japan's ability to exert its dominance in the Pacific was effectively crippled. Midway had not just been a naval battle, it was a symbolic and strategic collapse of Japan's once feared military strength. The Japanese response was to retreat and regroup, focusing on fortifying their remaining strongholds in the Pacific and strengthening their air defenses. But their ability to launch large-scale offensive operations had been permanently hampered. Without their carriers, they could no longer control the skies, or project power with the same efficiency. The loss of Midway was the first major blow to Japan's expansionist ambitions, and while they would continue to fight fiercely, they could not recover the strategic initiative they had once held. The psychological damage to the Japanese military and civilian morale was immense. In the years leading up to the war, the Japanese people had been conditioned to believe in the superiority of their military and the invincibility of their Imperial Navy. The loss at Midway shattered this belief. News of the defeat spread quickly, and as Japan reeled from the blow, its leaders were forced to confront a stark reality. They were not the undisputed masters of the Pacific. The loss of Midway had not just reduced their fleet, it had diminished their hope of winning the war. Meanwhile, on the American side, Midway was seen as a resounding success, one of the greatest victories of the Pacific campaign. The morale boost was immediate and powerful. The U.S. Navy, which had been battered by the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor and then struggled through early defeats in the Pacific, now had a tangible victory to rally behind. The battle had proven that American forces, though outnumbered and initially underestimated, could deliver decisive blows to the heart of the Japanese fleet. The victory also validated the importance of intelligence, air power, and strategic bombing in modern warfare. For the U.S. military, Midway was not just a battle won, it was a confirmation of the new strategy of aerial bombardment and naval warfare, which would come to define the rest of the conflict in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway marked the first major shift in momentum of the Pacific War, but it was not the final blow to Japan. The war continued for another 3 years, with bloody battles in the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines. However, Midway established a new strategic paradigm, one where the United States would maintain air superiority and continue to use bombers to strike at the heart of Japan's remaining naval strength. It also set the stage for the eventual American advance toward Japan's home islands, culminating in the air raids that would devastate Tokyo and other major cities. Japan's defeat at Midway would be compounded in the following months, as the US shifted into an aggressive offensive posture. The Battle of the Coral Sea, followed by Midway, showed the Japanese military that their once invincible carrier fleet could no longer be relied upon. American bombers, both in the air and from aircraft carriers, would continue to strike deep into Japanese territory, weakening their ability to fight. The Japanese, unable to replace their losses at Midway, now found themselves unable to contest American naval power in any meaningful way. In the broader context of the war, the psychological shock of Midway reverberated across Japan's leadership. The Japanese government and military, despite continuing to fight bravely and fiercely, now realized they were on the defensive. Midway had not been the war's decisive battle, but it had dealt a fatal blow to Japan's ability to conduct its war of expansion. The belief that they could win the Pacific War faded with each passing month. From an American perspective, the victory at Midway reinforced the role of air power as the deciding factor in the Pacific theater. The bombers, once ridiculed and underestimated, had proven themselves as the true weapon of war. Their ability to strike at the heart of Japan's naval power changed the strategic calculus of the entire conflict. The bombing runs that crippled the Japanese carriers would be echoed in every subsequent campaign, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima, as American forces used air superiority to pave the way for victory. In the larger scope of the war, the Battle of Midway also signaled a shift in the overall war effort. The Japanese, still committed to the fight, would not capitulate easily, but the balance had irrevocably shifted in favor of the United States. The war in the Pacific would continue for several more years, but now the US would steadily gain ground. The strategic bombing campaign, led by the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers, would become the backbone of this strategy, setting the stage for the ultimate defeat of Japan in 1945. The American victory at Midway, however, came at a cost. While the U.S. Navy had suffered the loss of the USS Yorktown and other casualties, the victory was more than just a military success. It was a victory of will, strategy, and technological superiority. The bombers that had once been mocked had now proven themselves as game changers, and their effectiveness would reverberate across the entire Pacific theater for the remainder of the war. For Japan, Midway was a bitter lesson. Underestimating the power of air forces, and especially American bombers, had been their critical mistake. Their ships, their pride, had been reduced to rubble by an enemy they had initially dismissed. The laughable, slow-moving American bombers were now a symbol of their defeat. The Battle of Midway stands as one of the most significant turning points in the history of warfare. It not only marked the collapse of Japan's dominance in the Pacific, but also heralded the rise of air power as a decisive factor in modern warfare. For Japan, it was a devastating blow, a loss that shattered their sense of invulnerability and forced them into a defensive posture they could never fully recover from. The confidence with which they had once approached the war believing in the absolute superiority of their naval strength, evaporated in a matter of hours. The bombers that they had once laughed at slow, clumsy machines in their eyes had torn through their most powerful ships, leaving their fleet in ruins. For the United States, Midway was a moment of validation. The bombers that had been ridiculed, questioned, and dismissed proved themselves to be the most effective weapon in the Pacific War. Their precision and destructive power forever altered the course of naval warfare. American air power had become the cornerstone of the strategy that would eventually lead to victory over Japan. The success at Midway gave the U.S. a sense of newfound confidence and momentum, as it demonstrated that even when outnumbered, American forces could strike with devastating impact, turning the tide of the war. Yet, in the grand scheme of history, Midway also serves as a reminder of the unpredictability of war. The idea that the war in the Pacific could have been won or lost in such a short time, on the decks of a few burning aircraft carriers, underscores how fragile military dominance can be. In the end, what appeared to be a laughingstock to one side became the instrument of their defeat. The power of innovation, the unanticipated might of air power, and the relentless determination of the U.S. military all converged at Midway. For those who lived through it, whether on the decks of the American bombers, in the heat of battle, or in the cramped spaces of the Japanese ships, Midway remains a stark reminder that in war, everything can change in an instant. The laughter of the Japanese soldiers, once mocking the bombers, was silenced in the face of their own destruction. The men who flew those bombers, at first uncertain of their mission, became the bearers of a new era of warfare, proving that the tide of battle can turn not just on the strength of guns and ships, but on the power of precision, technology, and intelligence. And while Midway did not mark the end of the war in the Pacific, it laid the foundation for everything that came after. It was the moment when the balance of power in the Pacific shifted, forever altering the course of history. Midway was not just a victory. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare, one where air superiority, precision bombing, and technological innovation would redefine the battlefield.